Thank you very much. It is my big honor to present my book, which current title is "The Sun of Ukraine Rises in the Donbas." As you can guess from the title, the book is about Ukraine's eastern region, Donetsk and Lugansk Oblast. And I start out by saying, forget everything that you think you know about the Donbas. And even if you think, okay, but this I know for sure, probably I'm going to prove you wrong in just a couple of seconds. And there are actually a lot of presentations during these 3 days which kind of led to what I'm going to say. So basically, Donbas is an image. It's a myth, a constructed artificial myth. Donbas stands for Donetsk Kolbazin, so Donbas, the abbreviation. This is the term which was conceived by a Russian engineer in the 19th century. But the truth is that the coal and steel, for which Donbas is famous, there are a lot of stories about the coal and steel, but what you need most to know is that since at least 1960s, it was already of such low quality, and it was produced in such bad security conditions that it was actually no longer even economically efficient to do that. But it was continued to be mined simply because it was the Soviet Union with a planned economy, and there were some crazy ideas about various fields of economy. So even this concept of coal and steel basin, coal and steel cradle, and this image of a proletariat presenting this basin was actually a fake. Even the Soviet characters, very famous ones, were actually also either completely artificial, so just made up, or like Stakhanov, they were purposefully, endowed by traits, and the story was artificially created just to produce the image. This was one thing about Donbas. But another is that this produced artificial image obscured its heterogeneity. So we perceive the region as something homogeneous or relatively homogeneous, even now, even inside Ukraine, among many strands of society. But in fact, this is just not true. Donbas consists of many different sub-regions, different locations, different identities, different languages, and different confessions. Of course, the Ukrainian identity in it, and also in heterogeneous and diverse meaning of what Ukrainian is. So I became aware of it after 2014, so after the Russian aggression, when people started coming out of the region. And this is an illustration of how underrepresented the voices of the Donetsk and Lugansk Oblast actually were, even in the Ukrainian fabric, let alone again abroad. I met people like Oksana Mikheeva, Stanislav Fedorchuk, and many, many others. And it was like shock and wow. And I thought, okay, this idea found me, and I didn't find it found me. I have to tell this story. So I started looking out for stories. And actually, as Anne mentioned, I liked it very much in her presentation. She said this is a book for general audience written by researchers. The same case for me. My book is not an academic book. It's a book, non-fiction, written by a researcher for non-researchers. And I found and based myself around 5 topics in the book, which are the academia and intellectual circles, the art societies and milieus, the village, so the countryside, the cradle of the Ukrainian culture, the European identity of Donetsk and Lugansk Oblast, and the religious denominations, because surprise, the Orthodox was not the most popular confession in the Donbas, despite what the Russian propaganda or even the popular image already says, but actually the Protestants were in a relative majority. They were the most, among the active believers, Protestants were and are, I think, still most active. What is also important to say is the book is written about these movements and communities before 2014. So this is not about how the region was transformed by the aggression. This was how it was transforming before the aggression. And this is what I think is valuable. I would like to tell you very briefly just 3 stories from the book. Sorry, how does it work? The green one? This one. Yeah, right. So, but there are other slides before that. There were slides. Okay, that's very weird. There were supposed to be other slides, but anyway. Okay, so the first story is, I called it the Battle for Stus, the story of Yuri Matusiak and Postov. To the right, you can see the picture of Vasyl Stus, who is the national hero of Ukraine, a prominent poet and a dissident who was killed under still unidentified conditions in the prison camp in 1985. So 6 years before the dissolution of the Soviet Union, Ukrainian dissidents were still killed in the Russian prisons. To the left, you can see Yuri Matusiak, a Ukrainian young guy who basically was born actually in the same year as I was, in 1987, who grew up in Donetsk. The commonality between these two men are that they're both the teachers. Matusiak was the teacher of the Ukrainian history, and Vasyl Stus was the teacher of the Ukrainian language and literature, and both of them were connected to Donetsk. Matusiak was Donetsk native, and Stus was not born in Donetsk, but taught there and spent much of his life there. In 2005, in Donetsk National University, this guy, together with quite a large group, actually dozens of other students, started a student organization. Their goal was to promote the Ukrainian identity, the Ukrainian culture in a very, I would say, nowadays normal topics. So commemorating Holodomor, celebrating Ukrainian holidays like Christmas, commemorating Ukrainian battle for independence struggle throughout to different stages of its history. And one of the campaigns was to rename the Donetsk National University after Vasyl Stus, which was probably also quite an obvious proposal, but not for the university authorities. This story is not only about the first powerful, youthful, so those who would already engage the young generation of the region's locals and natives, but it is also about how the old mentality, so the old post-Soviet mentality, stood against the new national narrative. Basically, the story is unfolded in the way that the campaign gained more and more attention. There was an appeal in the Ukraine National Day newspaper for the renaming, and even the Minister of Education and the MP said their word. The diaspora supported the move, but the local authorities did everything to discredit the students, threatening them with expelling, and the campaign did not fly. So the students were actually repressed by the authorities, who perceived this renaming the university after Stus, who already in 2005 was nationally recognized as the hero of Ukraine, and the campaign was in 2008, as a trespassing on their territory. The authorities were connected to the local party of the regions, and also some of them later joined the so-called DNR regime and then fled to Moscow. Yuri Matusiak story went on, after the graduation, he went on to serve in the army almost immediately after the Russian aggression, so maybe, I think in June he joined the army, and he was killed in Ilovaisk when the Russians offered, well, they said they would make a green corridor, but when the Ukrainian soldiers were leaving, they shot at them, and he was one of those who died in Ilovaisk. In 2016, the Donetsk National University was renamed after Vasyl Stus for many reasons, but one was already in commemoration of Yuri Matusiak, whose memorial you can see in the Donetsk National University, which is now moved to Vinnytsia, which was moved to, in 2014, to Vinnytsia as a displaced university. The story of Yuri Matusiak is written in the novel by Alexander Ivanyuk, Amorte. I would encourage you to, Amore Amorte, the full title is, and the lady next to him is his girlfriend, Francesca, whose testimony was used for writing the novel. And it also tells a lot about the struggle, not only about his personal story, but about this useful struggle of old against the new. despite the fact that Yuri Motychak is no longer with us, there are many people, his friends and colleagues, who are still doing much for Ukraine's independence overall and for telling the story of the region. Many of them are journalists and public activists, civic activists, and also helped me with writing the book. The next story, if I have time, I will briefly tell you this about is the story of izolatsia, so isolation space. And I call the story plant turned museum turned prison. This is a story I think which is super postmodern, intertextual, and you cannot just make it up, but it was just true. So the lady on the slide is Kateryna Mohyla, who in 2010 decided to use the old and non-functioning plant of isolation materials in Donetsk to make it an art space, a very European practice, which she actually picked up in Germany, where she lived for some time. And the interesting thing is that she was the daughter of the decade-long director of this plant. And he did not want to give it up. For him, it was kind of acknowledging that it's no longer rational yet to even run it or do something with it in terms of industry. And she said, this plant was the center, one of the city centers in terms of life. So let's bring life to it again, but through the art space. So what they did in 2010 to 2014, they did many exhibitions, dozens of them. They are still available on the website of isolation, which still functions. Fast forward to now, of course, not in Donetsk. So this is the idea which was extremely innovative for 2010 in Ukraine. There were no industrial spaces used for this kind of art purposes elsewhere at that time. But also it was about a liberal mind. So there was no political idea in it, at least not eloquently, not stated, but in terms of what they did, in terms of the creative ideas and liberalism, this was, of course, the anti-dictatorship agenda, anti-repression, and anti-Soviet in any way. And this is absolutely grassroots with local business. So what I would like to stress that this is not something instigated from somewhere. All of my movements and stories which I describe, they are absolutely grassroots. Of course, the isolation did not pass unnoticed by the various forces which operated in the region. It is absolutely amazing that the bright picture which you can see right now is the first Ukrainian literature festival taking place in Donetsk on the 23rd and 24th of April 2014, when some of the governmental buildings, local governmental buildings, were already occupied. So Ukrainian, this is Lubko Derosh, Ukrainian writer, and this is Kateryna Babkina, and there are many other prominent Ukrainian figures in writing and literature who attended this seminar. And there are also many more pictures which I did not put, but this is amazing how, what was so needed for many years in Donetsk and Lugansk Oblast just started to grow up, and then it was abruptly cut by Russia when it came in 2014. But this is, again, local initiative and extremely brave one. This is the same space, and you can guess what it turned to be. Very convenient to make a prison. So the isolation, of course, requires here many meanings. So one, isolation is isolation material, so production, industry, and then fancy artistic name for a museum space, and then the isolation proper, isolation of the imprisonment. There is a famous Ukrainian writer, Stanislav Aseyev, who lived in the occupied Donetsk for 2 years and made dispatches to Ukrainian weekly paper Dzarkalo Tizhnya under a pseudonym, and then he was captured in 2017 and spent almost 3 years in captivity in the isolation. This story is important because we have to realize that some people who are in the occupied territory, there's a lot of stigma in the Ukrainian society, but there are other people like Aseyev who observe and who are actually as Olena Stashkin, another prominent Ukrainian writer, said about her friend, who are waiting there to greet the Ukrainian soldiers with flowers. So again, this countered this narrative again about the pro-Russian separatism who just dreamt all their lives to meet Russia there. This is not true, or not true for everyone. Stanisław wrote his book after he was liberated from his almost 3-year-long captivity. He wrote a book which is called Світлий шлях, the light way. It was translated and published in English, I think, this year. I also strongly encourage you to read it in Ukrainian or in English. And finally, to conclude, so these are just various stories. I have many more in the book. There's just something to get you interested. Europe's borderland, the story of Donetsk Euromaidan. So I told you that the myth of the Donbas is just a myth in terms of coal and steel. Now, I think the biggest hypocrisy of the region and of its industrial potential is that it was created fully and totally by European industrial facilities, by majorly four countries, so Britain, Germany, France, and Belgium, who divided the region in 4, so to say, zones of influence and created various plants there and various facilities. In the end of the 19th century. When the World War I started and when there was the revolution in the Tsar Russia and Bolsheviks came to power, they expropriated the facilities and went on using them. So there is not a single Russian invention, or Soviet for that matter. This was something stolen. For this reason, actually, Belgium did not recognize the Soviet Union until 1935. So the myth of the Donbas is a total creation, and the industrial history actually started with the European investment and European mind and construction. But what is important, on the other hand, to understand that all these narratives about the pro-Russian region also don't hold super tight. It is true that the association agreement with the European Union was not supported by neither absolute nor relative majority, but it is also true that there was Euromaidan. And not only in Donetsk and Lugansk, but also in Kramatorsk, in Slovyansk, in Pokrovsk, in Mariupol, and this is open data. It was not too numerous, so there were hundreds, at most thousands of people, but it also should be mentioned that there was this lack of civic activism in the region before 2014. So the fact of how many people you actually can expect to come out, this also mattered. You can see in these pictures, well, in the first place, of course, the protesters themselves. In the bottom left, it's Serhiy Zhatan, prominent Ukrainian writer, who is holding a sign in Russian, Donbas against Yanukovych. And the picture on the bottom right is the police against the protesters. Apparently, the police is seemingly observing, but in fact, they are ready to intervene and to beat the protesters, which actually happened in January 2014, when the Titushki, who I already mentioned on Friday, came to beat the protesters, and the police just observed or helped.
Kateryna, maybe let's open to questions.
This is the end. Finally, I would just like to conclude with this picture, which I love very much, is dear to my heart. This is, of course, Donetsk. And the picture is taken the 1st of March of 2014. And this is not about Euromaidan anymore. This is about Ukraine. This was the protest or demonstration for the united Ukraine. It started in March, when the locals realized that something more than the association agreement for them was at stake. And they came out, and here you can see 10,000 of people already. And the rest you know. But I think this is good food for thought.